So I'll just I'll say a couple things just in terms of how I conceived of conducting this. There's a lot of questions. If you looked through the program, there's a lot of different questions that may or may not be things that we touch upon. But I'm going to kind of lead off with a few sort of like high-level questions that I'd like each of the panelists to address and possibly get at some of those issues. Then we'll, let the conversation evolve a bit among the panel, and then we'll turn to audience questions and conversations at a point that feels organic to the conversation. So unlike the last panel where there were prepared statements at the beginning, we're going to kind of launch off with some questions. And I'll introduce Aaron James, Chair and Professor of Philosophy here at UCI, David Pan in German in the Department of European Languages and Studies at UCI, and Matthew Smith, who I've just met, who is the president of a college in Costa Mesa, Hildegard College, which you'll probably have the opportunity to say a little bit about that because it's rather interesting and perhaps not unique, but an interesting combination. I will start with just saying a few things to kind of frame the initial questions. I was interested in seeing the title of this session framed as the future of humanistic education. And I think there is a relevant difference to be made between the humanistic and the humanities, and there's obviously a relationship between them, but they're really not the same. And when you hear the term humanistic, you hear the term humanism within that. And from a European perspective, that really emerges in 15th and 16th century Europe, especially connected with the rediscovery of classical antiquity, but also, I think really importantly, intertwined with the rise of early modern science and a kind of scientific investigation, a new sort of empiricism with respect to nature and experimental procedures and so forth that we associate with the long trajectory of the development of the sciences. I would really define the humanistic as focusing on the human being as capable of self-understanding and of self-formation through action and thought and reflection. And secondly, focusing on the human capacity to understand the world through the means and the techniques of the human mind. And of course, our philosophy department has a very strong epistemological focus, and I think in that sense, they're the inheritors of this humanistic project. I've just spoken really about Europe. If we expand the purview beyond Europe, obviously the timing and the exact factors are different, but we see both endogenous parallel developments as well as, of course, quite a bit of interrelations through global communication of these emerging ideas in very many places in the world. So we can broadly call humanism a focus that really is on scholarship, certain kinds of techniques of scholarship, ethical self-cultivation, and a focus on action that ultimately translates into being able to act in the public domain and in government and so forth. So when we talk about humanistic education as forming leaders, we're again in that long tradition. Now the humanities, as we understand them and as we bear the name in the school, is a much more recent development. So I would fast forward to the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when what we think of as the humanities were really in formation. And the big factor is really the incredible development of the natural sciences and also of technology and engineering in a way that required the humanities to start the sort of self-justification that I think that we still see and try to distinguish itself from the methodologies and the orientations and values of the natural sciences and really focus on what is particular to humanistic scholarship. That's especially a focus on historical criticism and on a textual basis. And I think that's an important element to really think about. One other thing I want to say about the humanities, because I think that there is, even in the questions that are framed here, a sort of assumption that we're in a crisis moment. And there's certainly changes that are taking place. There are some worrisome changes that are taking place. But I also want to point to the incredible dynamism of the disciplines in the humanities. Many of the humanities disciplines, or the areas within the traditional disciplines, philosophy, English, history, and so forth, are really newly emergent, and they're emergent in relation to emerging social factors, political factors. Bill Maurer talked about that in relation to the social sciences, and I think we see a similar kind of thing in the humanities. Two more observations. We hear a lot about STEM and humanities. I think that whoever invented the STEM moniker should win the Nobel Prize for marketing, because it's an incredibly successful packaging of an incredibly heterogeneous set of disciplines that have, various different kinds of impacts, basic research, applied research, and so forth. Humanities has sucked at marketing. We should get the Booby Prize for marketing. But I think that there's no more coherence in the notion of STEM as there is in kind of this dynamic and developing sphere of the humanities. Lastly, there are pressures on the human object of humanistic investigation. New literacies, I talked about the textual basis and the historical basis, new conceptions of the human, and I'll just mention, the very thin economic notion of maximalizing human capital economic agents as basically explaining lots of spheres of human life. Or, another version is data all the way up and all the way down, from the cosmos to the social network, all the way down to the molecular and cellular level. It's all data. These are fundamental challenges to what we think of as the human object of humanities investigation. And then we've talked about AI, the technological elision of certain kinds of, at least up till recently, domains of thinking and action that have been thought of as typifying and characteristic of humans, that now we may not be the only agents that engage in some of these forms of thinking and agency. Okay, so I won't go on. This is not my presentation, but I wanted to give a little bit of a frame for some of the questions that will have to do with the humanities in relation to the session. So I wanted to ask each of the panelists to start with identifying their biggest concern, or perhaps the matter that's really capturing the greatest attention in connection to their various relations to the humanities. And I'll just go in order of Aaron first.
Greatest concern.
Yeah, greatest concern, or what's really capturing your attention in relation to your position in the humanities.
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing is that from a philosopher's point of view, taking that as sort of paradigmatic, what is the humanistic enterprise, how it's massively misrepresented. And that might be our failure of communication, or it might be, just active misrepresentation to start. But I mean, for example, just teaching, a couple examples. Teaching, every year I teach Introduction to Ethics, and I start with Plato's Gorgias. And every year I read it and I have this thrill of, my God, Plato, what an amazing philosopher, And the students are just lit and alive, like, whoa, he said that then, that's what they were arguing about, that's so relevant, it's you're analyzing current events and opinion and belief and lots of stuff that applies to your social media feed, and Plato's not optimistic about democracy, so I have this thrill, and it's not even that the turn to the virtual has made that all worse, because in some ways after COVID, after having videos even in that course, when we went to the flip format, so where students watch videos and you come in and discuss, when you have a good group together, it's just, you get Socratic discussion, you know, kind of, I mean, it's just the best teaching I've done in 20 years has come out of that context. So in that sense, that's just humanistic inquiry alive. And it captures some of the joy I felt when I became a philosophy major, which wasn't about how I'm at the ROI, even though I'm totally on board with the ROI argument. You can use Wall Street Journal data, make the ROI argument. I'm all for it. But I mean, to me, it was, I just wanted, sort of, as a way of putting it, I wanted to know how to make up my mind. I wanted the tools to be able to make up my mind on all these fundamental issues. Does God exist? Free will, determinism, relation between science, morality. You know, it was like, this was this sort of incredible thing. I didn't, you know, ask AI, it can't tell you the answers to those questions. It can give you the way people have answered it so far. Like Picasso says, the problem with computers is they only give you answers. Now you can ask, they'll give you questions, but they don't give you live questions for you to resolve, for you to actively make up your mind. That's the thrill of philosophy and humanistic inquiry that I experienced right from the beginning. I still see it in the classroom when students just read Plato, and that joy all comes back. And now that, by the way, doesn't align very well with any kind of political leanings at all. When I teach that, or even a little political philosophy in that course or other courses, I mean, nothing when I teach political philosophy tracks any kind of partisan alignments or party configuration. I mean, it's all scrambled. I mean, nothing, there's not conservative, liberal, blah, blah, blah. Those terms, to me, don't really mean anything. Those are just sort of like tribal labels. It's just like there's all this mixing and matching, and, you know, and by the way, like and one question is, for example, you're talking about utilitarianism. Is it okay to enslave part of the population for the economic benefits of many? Well, utilitarian says it is. Well, now let's discuss. You know, like, okay, no, that doesn't seem okay. Well, why? You know, why is it? You know, like, I mean, there's not, you know, all these out of the box questions. You know, like, there's this kind of thrill the students have. Wait a minute, you're asking me to make up my mind. And also, some of the students sometimes ask me, like, Professor James, what do you think about these things? And I say, I'm not going to tell you. I will tell you I have strong views about these things because I don't want them to think it's pointless. The inquiry is pointless. I say, I've landed in some place, but I'm not going to tell you what I think about it. So, I mean, if that's at all representative anyway, that's my experience of what humanistic inquiry is, and the representation of you see outside for lots of other political purposes is massively distorted. Now, like, and just a quick connection then, one reason I like the ancient fides of the intellectual, appeal to intellectual character and intellectual virtues, because it goes back and captures some of that, what I experienced about what's basic about philosophy and why have a college, why have a university, what's the value of university education aside from the ROI, you know, so it kind of captures some of that, that make up your mind, freedom to make up your mind, the empowerment of making up, exercising reason, wherever it leads you, that sort of way of being empowered as a rational creature. That's a gloss on it, kind of rationalist, you don't have to go with that, that's loading too much in, but anyway, so start with that.
Thanks, Aaron. I'll pass the mic to David.
I did prepare some remarks, but I guess we're doing a different format, so I will just maybe rethink and answer the question, and maybe in that way maybe communicate the gist of my remarks. So I would say that if I had to focus on one big problem, I would say that the biggest problem we face right now is I guess the victory of multiculturalism. In the universities, this kind of began a debate in the 1980s about the Western culture curriculum, and that has been kind of shoved aside in order to really think of the world's tradition as all somehow equally valid, and they should all be taught with equal validity. And I think that's the basic kind of multicultural framework. And I see that as really the reason in which the humanities have really come into crisis, and why they're being attacked, and I think justifiably so, because I see that the problem is that any tradition, and I guess this is the multicultural insight, is that every tradition is equally valid, and if every tradition is equally valid, then there's obviously no reason to choose one tradition over the other. And if that's the case, then the only measure of validity for a tradition is the tradition you have, right? So you're thrown back upon your tradition precisely because of the arbitrary quality of tradition. I mean, it's very similar to, I guess, how we have to think about language, right? We've been raised into a particular language, and there's no particular reason why we speak one language over another, so therefore we then, I guess, hold on to our own language all the more fervently because there's no reason to change. And so I think that really should be the framework in which we think of our traditions, and that we do need to hold on to our Western traditions and see that as the basis for the humanities in our universities. Now, given that, though, I don't, just as languages evolve and change, traditions do that as well. And I think in the case of our traditions, we need to be evaluating our traditions in terms of the overall purposes of our humanities education, which I think in the United States, are oriented around promoting liberal democratic values. Right? I mean, this is the kind of, I think, the way that we have understood our Western tradition as, in some sense, culminating in who we are, and part of the essential aspect of who we are as a nation is as a republic, depending upon government, whatever, by the people, for the people, of the people. And in that sense, it's crucial for us to be teaching the types of virtues that we need for upholding that republic, right? And so if we think about then humanities education as supporting liberal democratic virtues as opposed to, say, ethnic group support or something like that. I mean, I guess I'm in the field of German, and I've studied quite a lot 20th century German literature and philosophy and politics, especially in the Nazi period. And there you did have humanities disciplines that were oriented around, I guess you would have to say, ethnic cleansing, right? And anti-Semitism. And that was the overall sort of context of values in which the humanities had to be understood there. So the humanities are not just about the human, it's really about a certain set of values that you hold within a culture, and that will be then the kind of filtering mechanism by which you're going to evaluate that culture and your own traditions. And so that aspect, though, I think has also been eroded by the kind of the multiculturalist approach, which tends to see humans as humans rather than as particular people in a particular tradition with a particular set of values. And that insistence on a particular set of values, that's going to change the way we look at the humanities in any particular time and place. And that's also going to be something that is going to promote the type of debate and discourse that I think has vanished from the universities, and for that reason been taken up outside of formal university context. I mean, I think, Charlie Kirk was somebody who brought debate to campuses because campuses had abandoned debate, real debate. His assassination was so tragic because precisely he was the one that was brought real, I guess you would say, vital humanities activity back to campuses where it has really disappeared. Because I mean, the dearth of conservative voices in campuses is really it's clear to everybody, both within universities, maybe not within universities, but certainly outside of universities. And that's precisely the reason that humanities have lost their legitimacy in the wider culture. So, the final thing that I think that we need to hold on to about humanities education is then this I guess the methods in terms of what we're trying to promote and how we're going to do it. And I think we need to get back to debate. And so if we narrow our curriculum, which is to say narrow it back down to a very central core of texts, we're going to be promoting much more scholarly debate, because a lot of what happens now in our scholarship in humanities is so scattered and fragmented into all sorts of different texts from different traditions that it's very rare that two scholars will come together, are talking about the same texts, and having real differences of opinion and debate, and that doesn't happen enough. And if we can narrow our scope of inquiry, that's going to improve our humanities. And also, I do think we need to, dump the DEI, but introduce viewpoint DEI, viewpoint diversity as a goal of our hiring practices. And then finally, I have to say it. I think we need to dissolve our gender studies and ethnic studies departments, and those faculty need to be integrated into the basic disciplines of philosophy, history, and the arts, in which then those, because those departments are basically perspectives that have been solidified into disciplines, which is to say that those perspectives are never put into question. And so you integrate those faculty back into the primary philosophy, history, and the arts faculties, then you can bring that debate back into those disciplines, into those faculty. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
You can pass the torch to Matthew.
Thank you. And I'm, as the outsider here, not from UCI, I'm honored to be included here. And your opening statements, Tyrus, were so rich and thought-provoking to me, and I started taking notes because you were saying interesting things, and I thought that was going to stop and that was going to be the question, and you keep on saying something else. In answer to your question, though, I'm not going to, this is not my official answer because I don't have any good response to it, nor have I ever heard one, but I'm most concerned about AI and education, specifically that it's going to hurt the education of our children and especially young adults and grad students and everybody else. I don't know how to solve it. If anybody does, let me know. But what maybe another thing that concerns me about the study of the humanities, and I want to refer to the kind of taxonomy you described. I liked that, humanism to humanities. And I would maybe take a step even further back and say before the humanities, we can look to the liberal arts, which did not just have one form. It took many different forms. But the liberal arts, unlike the humanities, included traditionally 7 disciplines, and 4 of them would have been considered at the time, we would call them sciences, kind of. Geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy would maybe be considered sciences, whereas the 3 others, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, I guess we could call those humanities, but not really. The term humanities didn't really apply. So, but my point about the liberal arts is if I ask the question, what's the good of the liberal arts as people in the ancient world of the Middle Ages thought about it, it would be a good for the sake of society, I think. That's my hypothesis. And if you look at humanism as it developed in the Renaissance, it seemed to, if you look at how it changed education in Europe, emphasizing rhetoric and the memorization of rhetorical commonplaces, de-emphasizing things like logic, I think that you could say there's, the good of society is kind of replaced with the good of the individual. And your discussion about the rise of new science and technology put me in mind of this. We're relying more on technology. Think of whatever, William Harvey discovering the circulation of the blood or whatever you might think of, narrows the focus of humanistic study onto the human. And then the humanities, I appreciated your description of that as more of a modern development, and I would say a professional development. And so what concerns me a lot, I don't know about the most today, is the direction that the professionalization of the humanities has gone away from a view of the public good, which I think I say we all, assuming any of us who work in the humanities, I think we believe in that public good, but I think systemically it's not really set up to encourage that. And my example would just be, I used to teach in an English department, so my example would be, the way that many English major degrees, including the one I taught in, were designed, which is, we say things like, well, you're learning how to think well and you're learning how to communicate well, and you are. It does that. But they're essentially designed to create new English literature, in this case, researchers. That's what it's for. If you really look at how a lot of English majors are designed, the track is as if it's assuming that many of these students are going to become graduate students in that field. And I know some humanities departments at universities that have noticed this and have changed the structure of their majors and instead have created different tracks for different sorts of students and what they want to get out of it. But the reason I see this professionalization as dangerous is that I think it's dangerous isn't the right word, but at least alarming to me is I think that it's hurting our ability to make a case for the humanities, largely because students who are educated in the humanities at colleges and universities are educated in something professional, the ability to apply this, to look up secondary sources, to do certain kinds of research that is misaligned with the ends of the thing that they're studying, if I could say that, right? If you're studying Plato's Gorgias, or if you're studying Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or if you're studying, Things Fall Apart, or whatever it is, those are not intended to be, those are not trying to give knowledge that is quantifiable according to how many times it's cited, and whatever metric you look at online, or they're not even really intended to be experienced according to a scientific method. So I'm not advocating for an unscientific approach to humanities. I'm excited by those integrations, but I think as a professional field, we've lost sight of the good for society and maybe to some extent the good for the individual that you saw in the traditional liberal arts and humanistic education.
Thank you. So I'm actually going to pick up on a motif that David brought up and implicitly also Aaron. And that is in the kind of program of humanistic education, there were really two key elements. And one was really a recovery of certain kinds of elements of the past with which there was an identification. So kind of the constitution of a tradition. And also the work of translation. So, I mean, I think probably a 15th or 16th century Italian was not particularly close to, a 4th century Greek philosopher, but they had access through that, through the language, and were able, in some sense, to kind of create themselves differently by that sort of identification. I don't know your personal history, David, but you've reached into a German tradition that is pretty far from really American Republican thought, and in a different language that has a variety of elements of tradition, but it's not necessarily in an intuitive way part of the tradition in the way that you've talked about being embedded in a tradition. So the question that I'm kind of grappling towards is, to what extent are we offering students a entree into a tradition, and to what extent are we offering them a set of options for really thinking about traditions that they can create for themselves, that they can constitute themselves within? And that includes the learning of different languages. For instance, you use, David, the metaphorical term of a language that is provided by tradition, but literally we have other languages that open up traditions and pieces of tradition that students have options to choose among and judge among and evaluate. So I'm going to turn to whoever wants to take up that question, but my own position, and I'll just kind of say this, is that I think that ability to project oneself into something that's historically other and potentially culturally and linguistically other is a key part of what I think of as humanities education, and not simply an inculcation in the tradition.
I'll respond to that. So clearly, you're right. I spent most of my career dealing with the German tradition, and I obviously value the ability to bridge traditions. Obviously, a clear goal of our humanities education. But at the same time, that process of translation is precisely a process of selection. So, whatever the 13th, 14th century translator of Aristotle or Plato is not translating anything at all. He's specifically looking at these particular texts. And so that process of tradition really is one that's kind of suffused with this sort of value orientation that I talked about before, but it's also involved in a whole, I guess, a tradition of discourse in which there's a kind of a conversation going on, and obviously the German tradition is very important for the United States. It's very important for the Western tradition and the way that we think through lots of problems in philosophy and in literature and in history. So I guess I don't see that as a kind of an opposition in terms of our tradition versus somebody else's tradition. I do see it though as a kind of a zero-sum game in the sense that there's a limitation on how much we can learn, and we have to make choices about where to focus our attention. And these choices, I don't think we can leave those choices purely up to the. I mean, the students get to make some choices, but I think that as a faculty, as a university, we need to be making a lot of these choices in terms of defining the tradition and thinking through the purposes that we have in teaching particular texts. We obviously, I don't teach, for instance, Mein Kampf, which is, clearly a key part of the German tradition, but I just don't feel that that's so necessary for our purposes to be teaching, right? And so, there's, obviously every tradition is going to have its own ups and downs and lots of variety. But what we determine to be the primary humanities curriculum is going to involve a lot of these choices that I think need to be, to a certain extent, standardized, but also I think not up to even the faculty to decide on their own. And this is, you mentioned accountability, and I think part of accountability is that the kind of the resource decisions that we make about hiring somebody who focus on 20th century German literature versus somebody who might be focusing on, I don't want to single anybody out, but how about, whatever, 12th century Hungarian literature. I mean, I don't know anything about it. I don't know. This is maybe somebody I'm singling out, right? Yeah, right. But yeah. You singled me out too. So anyway, the issue though is really, there is, I think, a question about how to define the tradition, who gets to define that tradition. And I think that part of that really is going to come from outside the university. And so, I think, typically, if you look at I guess even the tradition of American colleges and universities, pre-World War II, colleges and universities were almost exclusively oriented around the Bible and I guess really, Greek and Latin, right? Modern languages really didn't play a huge role. In some sense, maybe histories did, but in any case, that orientation was really determined to a large extent by the denominations, the religious denominations that sponsored many of those early colleges. I mean, Harvard University was a Congregationalist college, right? And so I think that we do need to. I think that public and oversight over universities that is accomplished through the sponsors of the universities is very important for determining the tradition, and I think that's rightfully so.
Thank you, and I'll just add, that theology and classics was seen as the necessary training to be part of if you will, the ruling class. Matthew, you have a particular institution that merges a business curriculum and I would imagine a fairly prescriptive great books curriculum. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, the thinking that you have about the tradition that's represented in so-called great books and what are the cultural values that you see as embodied by that?
Yeah, thank you. So in brief, I teach at a very, very new small college in Costa Mesa, a few miles from here, called Hildegard College, that offers a single degree, a Bachelor of Arts in Liberal Arts and Entrepreneurship. So we are endeavoring to synthesize, we don't differentiate between gen ed and a major. We're endeavoring to synthesize the study of especially historical primary sources with a project-based study of entrepreneurship and what we call the entrepreneurial arts. And I would describe us as a great books college. So this question of tradition is really, really important to me. But I have a love-hate relationship with it because I believe that a quote-unquote great books education, which I designed and we teach, is one of the most unhinged ideas that there is. And even historically, it's only maybe 100 years old. If you count back to Mortimer Adler and the University of Chicago and then Columbia, it's not a very old idea. And you can look at these old, Britannica or University of Chicago great books of the Western world sets and things like that. And I call it unhinged because if you ever, and I wonder if anybody here has, but if you ever were taught in a great books program where you're reading, not necessarily chronologically, we read thematically, but it's kind of like mini chronologically, but you read through a canon of selected, as David says, selected books that have passed the test of time. You are reading things that they're divergent from each other. They're in totally different historical contexts. And this semester, I think that we're reading, Teresa of Avila and W.E.B. Du Bois and Immanuel Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. We just read Plato's Gorgias, as it happens. Boethius, we're all over the place. And so if you've taught in this curriculum, in any version of it, what you've seen is that, number one, it's very easy to misunderstand what an author is saying if you don't do the work of understanding where they're coming from historically. Number two, it's not a cohesive tradition that was conscious of itself in any way. And I'm not trying to devalue, this is what we teach at my college. And then thirdly, and maybe I'm disagreeing with David when I say this, for me, the good of, the highest good that is benefit of learning through a tradition of great primary source, those highest benefits are what we might call intellectual virtues rather than ideas. And so I understand the argument that if you live in a society that's based on certain principles, one of those principles being self-governance, and so it's in the interest of the society to educate young people a certain way so that they're capable of that self-governance. I understand that. But whatever, that depends on people having a certain idea of what society is. And we do nationally have we have debates about this historical idea of society. But I believe that more important than that are the intellectual virtues. And so, for example, we do teach Karl Marx and at the same time teach, Adam Smith. And we do teach Kant and at the same time teach, Hegel and Nietzsche. And we do that on purpose without favoring any of these authors. Because in my experience, and I really can only cite my experience here, but I'll submit it to you, it creates more intelligent, simply put, fluent in the history of ideas students. And they're able to, yes, make up their minds. We're not making it up for them. And that's, if I'm thinking about the social good, going back to the idea of the liberal arts being for the sake of the whole, or for the sake of the polis or the society, To me, at least, that's more important. I understand the argument for selecting certain ideas that you want to inculcate, maybe we can use that word in students, but I think that there are huge dangers to that, and I think one of those dangers is that it can actually inhibit the development of intellectual virtues, even inadvertently.
Thank you, Matthew. Aaron, you are the chair of the philosophy department, and I am going to be presumptuous in asking you maybe to think a little, to express how your faculty as a whole think about what should be in the curriculum and what shouldn't, how you make that kind of selection. It's not just like what goes on the spreadsheet or what everybody puts their chit in. There's some sort of set of value judgment. I mean, Plato is a star name, obviously. There's, there's some element of that. But I think there is a project in your curriculum, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Can I connect that to the Republic and why it lasts as well? That's what I was thinking about. Yeah, so I mean, there's a way that what we do, or the choices we make for books to read, things to assign, research topics, it's both backward-looking and forward-looking. It's backward-looking and look where there's a set of sort of canonical texts, ideas, frames, sets of ideas that a lot of us are familiar with in an area. But then we're looking to sort of innovate, create, reframe, and in a kind of creative way. That's what makes for a contribution in philosophy, right? And there's what's fun in philosophy was when you sort of get up to the cutting edge and you're like, wow, there are so many possibilities. That's exhilarating. But you're doing that not just as a point to communicate, as a point of reference, but you're sort of building on sort of traditions of ideas at the same time. So there's a way in which you're both looking back and looking forward over time, and that's what makes for good creative research. It's not just out of the blue, here's something whole cloth. I mean, philosophers, even ones that do sort of ahistorical philosophy, are very referring all the time to historical figures. I mean, including like in logic and philosophy of science, if you watch the way that they do philosophy of mathematics or homologic, they're constantly talking about the history of logic, history of mathematics, associating ideas with particular figures, citing facts about the context. I mean, it's the same kind of thing. So you can think of what we do as a kind of constructive interpretation, elaboration over time. And that's something everybody, I guess we would only hire somebody who was sort of on the same page with that enterprise within a rough set of like their preoccupations based on their training and where they might go with it. But then we're really open about where they might go with it. That's we celebrate, we want to see things go in a new direction. We don't know ahead of time. So there's a kind of backward reference that we sort of rely on a very rough sort. But then, for example, you could hire someone who's familiar with early modern philosophy and knows Hume and stuff. You might want to be sure that they have a good, solid knowledge of the state of knowledge. But then, if they wanted to work on Hume and Buddhism, because it's a similar view of the self, and even the history of how Hume might have had interacted with traveling Buddhists at the time, we'd be like, yeah, that's great, that's Hume studies, so. And that would be creative, right? That's good, just good philosophy. If it was just someone doing Buddhism out of nowhere, like maybe there's lots of interesting connections that refer to something familiar that might be interesting. Or you could make the case of it, on its own as well. But oftentimes there's a context there, and that's what all of our work is. We're all doing that in some ways. There's something recognizable and something that we're adding and developing on our own. And the point I wanted to, this sounds really pretentious to generalize from our philosophy department to a republic, but what I was going to say in answer to the republic.
Go for it, Aaron.
Yeah, go on. So, going back to like Franklin's famous line, like it's a republic. If you can keep it, there's almost a tone of resignation. It's not, he didn't mean to resign there, like good luck, it was recognizing the contingency. Like this project, a republic, is supposed to be something that can last in perpetuity, despite changing conditions. And how in the world could that be? Right? How could that? Well, it's only going to be because citizens themselves are willing, one generation to the next, working with each other to uphold and defend their liberties against tyranny. It's defend their liberties, all the common principles that are organizing their thing, the res publica, right? The thing they're doing together, their common project. And now, and that idea, to put it this way, there's a backward-looking version of that, which is that the way that each generation is supposed to be on the same page is by looking back at a sort of canon or set of texts or set of traditions, and that's what unifies them. And I think that's partly right. But it can't last because circumstances are changing and each generation needs to refresh and have their own dynamic appreciation and mutual embrace of the common principles in light of the received tradition. So every generation needs to renew and refresh the Republic for it to last in perpetuity, for it to have a chance to last 2-3 generations, let alone, or 250 years, where this one's, on shaky ground lately, but, but what made it last as well, what made for the sort of, what made the American century, the 20th century as a sort of democratic republic, I think, wasn't just that its institutions were democratic or its economic institutions were prosperous, the post-war economy being then the most prosperous economy in the history of the world, low poverty, low inequality, increasing liberty for all kinds, and leisure, progress on civil and gender rights in various ways relative to the time. What made that work as a set of institutions wasn't just representative institutions, it was the professionalization of these different, it's partly the administration parts of administrative bodies that are by people that weren't elected, maybe not experts, but people organized by broadly democratic principles, making good, sensible decisions, with still electoral accountability in the background. And then you have journalism as a profession, and you have the law as a profession, and you have the academy as a profession, organized by its own internal codes. So it has its own structure and set of incentives for lifetime career moves, but then also built-in expectations for what the job requires and how it's supposed to be dynamic. I mean, journalism, it's constantly changing events, holding power accountable, et cetera, telling truth. If it's law, it's doing this backward and forward thing. It's taking established precedent and bodies of law, applying to new events, novel contexts, the active interpretation, constructive interpretation. And then academia as well is taking the best of received knowledge and then applying it to novel programs. All the new stuff from the post-war showed the promise and excitement of that. And that's why that was sort of part of the social contract for academia, that Chancellor Gilman mentioned. Like it was partly that massive public investment could be justified in, say, public universities like the University of California, because they would have this role in sort of making democracy work. And that role isn't just the new good ideas that would come up, the new forms of new knowledge and understanding that would emerge from different disciplines as sort of refined expertise. It was also the education of the citizens who are then going to be informed of the old, but also adapted and creatively developed so they could, continue with the new and refresh the generation year after year. So like in this way of telling the story, like what made the American Republic experiment last as long as it has, so far we'll see if we can keep it, was in part this broad democratization of higher education and of a creative, both backward and forward looking kind.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, please.
So I guess you have a story of kind of professionalization. And that, to me, is precisely the way in which the Republic has undermined itself, really. Because I really see the Republic as grounded in the ability of citizens, non-professionals, to be engaging in the kind of collective discussion that would lead to the kind of collective decision-making that you would expect of a Republic. And precisely professionalization, I think, undercuts that. And I think I think we see that today precisely in the really virtual exclusion. I don't know if it's exclusion, but maybe de facto exclusion of conservative voices at universities. So that a lot of the political debates that really matter for our future are going on outside of the university, in which we've got a 50-50 republic in terms of like political affiliation, but we certainly don't have nearly 50. I don't know. It's probably like 99-1 in terms of university faculty, and so part of the issue here is really precisely the way in which that professionalization of knowledge, I suppose, has gone on in a way that has alienated that professional class from the rest of the population, and precisely undermined that kind of basic, I don't know what you call it, the basic premises of a republic, in which you're trying to integrate that kind of of political discourse all through the, the population.
And Matthew, you also expressed in your opening remarks concerns about the professionalization as perhaps
Yes, yeah, not in the sense that I think it undermines it undermines the university, especially a public university's ability to serve the ends for which it's funded by the state. I mean it in the sense of if we're asking a question like the written prompt for this panel have, if we're asking questions about the future of the humanities and is it really valuable to study the humanities in the eyes of employers, and is it, as especially mid-sized private universities consolidate or eliminate humanities majors altogether, is that because we no longer see the relevance of them? I believe in the value of humanistic study and think that partly it's our failure to market well, yes. But I also think it's that we've, the freight train has left the station in terms of the way that we design our degrees around professional academic practice rather than around the good of humanistic study. So you can take something like philosophy, for example. There are many ways to define philosophy etymologically, love of wisdom, right? But let's just, for the sake of conversation, say that, well, one of the main ends of studying philosophy is to become wiser. If I look at philosophy departments, in general, I don't see a huge effort to help people become wiser. In the full meaning of that, I see a lot that will help them become smarter and help them remember how to solve the kind of philosophical games you need to know and memorize, and help them get into graduate school, but not so much wiser. And I think if you look, and I don't mean to pick on philosophy, but if you look at learning assessment and learning outcomes and how that's measured, you'll see an absence of the virtue side of the intellectual virtue of wisdom. And I don't mean moral virtue because we're talking about intellectual virtue, but you see an absence of an attempt to measure that formation of a person. So that's what I mean by professionalization. I think it's kind of gotten away from us. I value it. I love research in the humanities. I partake in it myself, but and I should maybe lay my cards on the table and say I do not believe that it's easy for an institution to do research and teaching really, really well. At least in my judgment, the best research institutions are really research institutions, and the best teaching institutions are really teaching institutions. That might be an unpopular opinion, and I see that as somewhat evidence of the argument I'm making, but I'm happy to be disagreed with.
And I'll just throw in here that I think you're talking about one form of professionalization, but I think also our structure around majors, which are proto-professional preparation, is something of the default structure of instruction in a lot of universities and colleges. And I want to give a shout out to our philosophy department and to Duncan for really framing this discussion around intellectual virtues that in some ways is transversal to that kind of professional organization that's our default. I think this is a good time to open things up to the audience and see if we have questions or comments that we want to make. Doug.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, part of what we're trying to do with intellectual virtues precisely there's this liberatory view of education, which is, it's not just about professions. It's that you find this in von Humboldt, you find it in Dewey, you find it in John Henry Newman. To think of education just as about training people up professions is kind of, it's dehumanizing. It's kind of, it doesn't respect the dignity of peoples, and we respect their dignity by developing them to think for themselves. But actually, the thing I want to ask about related to a couple of points that David mentioned. One point which I agree with, which is this idea that in the humanities we need to be very cautious about intellectual relativism or epistemic relativism, and I would agree with that. I think that's really pernicious, that influence. But you then connected that to a quote-unquote Western tradition. I wanted to put a bit of pressure on that because I'm very skeptical about this Western tradition. So think about the ancient Greeks that cropped up a bit. Are they Western? You know, you might think they're canonically Western, right? They're described that way. But one thing I like to do with my students, there's a great, huge book like this that Bertrand Russell wrote called History of Western Philosophy, and it begins by saying, Western philosophy begins in ancient Greece with Thales and Miletus, who thought that everything was water. And I say to my students, where is Miletus? Their phones looking at that. Anyone know where Miletus is? In Turkey. Right? And they're like, whoa, hang on, this is, so Western philosophy begins in Turkey. Well, because there were Greek city-states along Anatolia. But then when you start looking at the history of this, it gets even more interesting. I mean, for hundreds of years, Greece wasn't west at all. It was east, because it's east of Rome. It's very late, relatively later, 1600s, it starts to become Western. There's a good reason for that, which I'll get to. Relatedly, the Greeks themselves, there's this view of the Greeks as like they get all these ideas ex nihilo. But that's actually not how they present it themselves. They present themselves as being influenced by other schools of thought in the Middle East, across the Mediterranean, earlier schools of thought in North Africa, Phoenicians and ancient Egypt, what we now call Egypt, that region. So you've got this, you know, this really vibrant intellectual tradition here, the Greek tradition, which is already connected to Eastern and African ideas. And then, you know, move forward a few hundred years. One of my favorites, Pyrrho, the skeptic. Pyrrhonian skepticism is incredibly similar, not coincidentally, with one of the two main schools of Buddhist thought. Why? Because they have a common antecedent, which is the Jainist mystics that practice along the river Indus. You know, Pyrrho makes it across the Indus with Alexander the Great on his travels. You know, go forward a few hundred years, and you've got, you know, the medieval period. Greek philosophy now is in, you know, the scholastic period. You've got the medieval theology, which is a lot of philosophy is done. But here you've got, you know, the Catholic thinkers in conversation with Islamic scholars as equals. You can't really disentangle Islamic thought from Western thought during that period. You know, you look at the actual history, there's all these deep connections between these different traditions. And the idea of a Western tradition really only crops up in the late 1600s and 1700s. And particularly, this idea of Greece forming these ideas ex nihilo and Greece being Western only starts to arise then. And, you know, if we're honest about it, why does it arise then? Because it coincides with European conquests and the need for a European story to be told about the West and sort of, you know, intellectual superiority. So this idea of the Western tradition actually is, when you start to look at it, you know, in the cold light of history, starts to look somewhat suspect. And one of the things I find quite exciting about ancient Greece is that in many ways it's not Western. It feels almost universal. And when you see its connections, to, you know, Eastern thought, classical Indian thought, Confucian thought, African thought, you know, Islamic thought, and so on, these connections are part of what makes it so interesting, and less so that it's part of something which is quote unquote Western. So I guess I want to say, you know, yeah, I'm with you, boo-hoo to epistemic relativism, but I'll be very aware about connecting that thought to, you know, to think the opposite of that is to think that there's this Western tradition, and that's how we combat the intellectual relativism.
Yeah. So my first book was it's called Primitive Renaissance. It's about how German expressionism really developed through an interaction with African sculpture. So totally on board with your idea of lots of cross-fertilization across different cultures, and that's how our tradition develops. Clearly, no question about that. Where I want to put a kind of limit to that is to say, in spite of that, we still can identify a kind of tradition in which you do have a kind of, I call it like a kind of common collective memory in which there's certain texts that recur. And yes, obviously those texts have various sources and there's lots of cross-fertilization, but when it comes down to it, we're still reading Plato, right? And that kind of recurrence of certain texts and themes that's really what I'm talking about in terms of a Western tradition. And I guess you don't have to call it Western, but you can call it kind of the, well, I think it makes most sense to call it Western, just because that's the discourse that we've developed in the United States about that. And I think the United States is, in a sense, singular in the sense that we don't really have a natural kind of tradition the way Germany or China or England might have, of saying, oh, these are our English texts or German texts that belong to our tradition. The United States is strangely unmoored in that way. And I think that's partly the reason why we've developed this notion of Western tradition that tries to give us some kind of a handle on what it is our tradition is, as malleable as it is, but still I think there are these recurring texts that provide these kind of guideposts. And I agree with you that we're not just teaching texts we agree with. I mean, I teach all these different texts as well. I don't particularly teach Hitler, but I do teach other Nazi philosophers in a sense, right? But the key is that there's a certain set of texts that I think there's a limit on. We don't want to put and that limit is based on a kind of tradition of reading and commenting on texts. And so in the same way that, I mean, obviously every language is a mishmash of different languages that have been integrated into that language, but in spite of that, you can still identify a particular language that's going to be clearly distinguished from a different one.
Julia? You.
Hi, thanks. Such a great discussion. Matt, I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about how you came to found a new college and what you think a university like ours, which is very professional and large, like what can we learn from the experiment that you've been conducting very courageously, and I've been following your work since you were a grad student at USC and been your colleague in many professional contexts. And I was very excited when you made this courageous move to start college. So what can we here have to learn from what you've been doing? And I know that you're not the only one doing these kinds of experiments. I'm sure you're in a strong network, and you're also in this intellectual virtues network and so forth. So I'd just like to have you share some more of that experience.
I appreciate curiosity, Julia. So let me give a 60-second version of why I, not just I, but other people left traditional academic environment to found a different kind of college. I would boil it down to realizing that we as an institution, that the university I used to teach at, could not answer the question, why do students learn what they learn? And the best you could answer that with is, well, it depends what they're learning. Or even what do students learn? It depends what they're learning. It depends what they're studying. And I believe that any serious intellectual inquiry has to have a starting point and has to have shared knowledge. And so me and some other people founded Hildegard College, which, as I told you, is just great books in entrepreneurship. It's very simple. It's cohort. Everything is discussion. The job of us as professors is mostly to ask a couple questions and then try to disappear from the perception of the students, and they just kind of run with it. That's the goal, at least. And there are many programs around the country like this, including at big traditional universities. They have, pockets that do this sort of thing. And many professors in traditional departments, especially in the humanities, also teach this sort of pedagogy. So there's nothing really special about us in that way. I think what we have discovered, and the bet that we sort of made, that we're beginning to see is a good bet to have made, is that we did not separate the study of the liberal arts through primary historical sources from the study of a very project-oriented, almost experimental business education. And if, at least in my perception, these are two things that are usually as far apart from one another at major universities as two things could be. And so our students, for instance, in the morning might be discussing Aquinas' Summa Theologica. And then in the afternoon, they're in what's called the Entrepreneurial Lab, building their own products, programs, or services under the guidance of their entrepreneurship faculty members, learning kind of basic principles of business, from strategy to marketing to finance to business model creation, whatever it might be. You could think of those as two separate sorts of education, but we've blended them. And so you see, for instance, as they're talking about economics and financial models and entrepreneurship, they're bringing up Aristotle's discussion of currency and the politics. Or if they're bringing up Shakespeare as they're thinking about like things that drive fundamental human desires. But more importantly than that, I think that I don't know if I would be as brave to say this is something that our little college experiment could teach any major university, but I would say that what we have found is that the study of the humanities does have a natural creative impulse. And those of you who teach in the humanities or study in it has probably experienced this. And we have this kind of, sometimes, I used to have at least a kind of purist idea that, as someone like Cardinal Newman might say, the study of philosophy or the study of liberal learning is an end in and of itself. There's something true about that. But if you really look at the luminaries of traditional liberal education, they're always doing something with it. They're always serving people or creating things or helping to guide their society in whatever capacity that they have. And we found that this creates a kind of natural channel between the study of interdisciplinary primary sources, which is how we do it, to students trying their hand at, I'm going to try to build this program for a behavioral health organization, or I'm going to build this after-school program for this Santa Ana Unified School District, or whatever it might be. That's fluid. It doesn't feel forced. And I think because of the way that our universities are structured, maybe we assume that these are very different sorts of educational endeavors. And I would just argue they don't have to be.
Before we go on to the next question, I just want to make sure, since I'm in the orchestra pit here, I'm seeing if there are other questions in the back. Okay, because I can't see you as well, be energetic and gesticulating if you have questions, please.
Okay, so I think you guys have done a good job selling the value of humanities education, and I'm somebody who's on board with that. Somebody who's traveled and learned another language and expanded the borders of my cultural knowledge as this when I did so. But where is humanities education going now that we can translate not just a language very effectively? Like, it used to be very bad, but now it's pretty good at translating, like, from one language to another and getting really even some of the minutiae involved. And similarly at summarizing great books, philosophy, and this, like, it do a really good job of extracting these themes in the broadest of sense. So where are we going with this education in the future, given those aspects? And is there a way we can sort of extract value out of it still, given some of these tools?
Oh, sure. Let me give it to Aaron first, and then we'll hand it back to you, David.
That's on. It's on, yeah, thanks. I guess just as a way of seconding a point I sort of already made about a little bit, but it's, you have to think about the value of the process, of the creative process that's sort of part of the autonomous exercise of, well, reason, judgment, interpretation, that you can't replace, even if an AI can do some of the tasks like really well. You're going through the process as part of the value. of it. I mean, this is, and part of it's part of what that you get results from human creativity, but it's also, like, well, Nietzsche, paraphrasing Nietzsche, the point of a song isn't to get to the end. The point of philosophy is not to get to the end or an answer or a result. It's part of it. Or you might put it as understanding is sort of the point of philosophy, but understanding doesn't necessarily lead you to a single view or conviction. But you do feel like, oh, I understand that. So you've gotten somewhere. It's not pointless, but it doesn't. And it's just that's like no amount of AI help or tools can do that for you, no matter how good the summaries are. I mean, and aside from that, there's just the limitations of what they are, which I think the humanist critic needs to note. This is based on the way I've just heard reported an AI sketch, the paper I'm just going to start reading, but it puts it really nicely that if you did an AI search before Galileo, and you put in Galileo's ideas at the time, and there was a large language model trained on existing things said about the planetary motions and stuff like that, it would tell you exactly, it would give you the old model, and it would tell you that, and you tell about what this new guy, Galileo, they would say he's a crank, it would just disregard it. It would say what we have is observationally adequate, because, he's, absolute, whatever. Or similarly, another example used in this, comes out of this paper, the Wright brothers, at the time, apparently, like flight, as they imagined it, was seen as impossible. I haven't confirmed this, but the New York Times even denounced the idea. This is foolish. And they just, in their kind of crazy way, no, there's got to be. So if you asked an AI trained on a data set just before the Wright brothers, like, is flight possible? Like, in defining that in a certain way, they would say no, it's impossible. Physicists know. It's the experiment or whatever. So those limitations of the AI are never going to, the human, we have to exercise our creative capacity, and we have to do it on whatever we're working with. And that could be the AI tools, but it's still a reflection. Maybe stochastic parrot is too minimal, or autocomplete is too minimal of a way of characterizing some of the amazing things it does that are honestly breathtaking. But I still don't think that we should think that that's a replacement for the process of human creativity, the exercise of skill, human thought, judgment, interpretation, the kind of thing that we do as researchers, you do as a scientist, you do as a philosopher, you do as a student. It's so it's the value of the process is as much as important. But the ROI is also there too.
So just start with your example of translation. So as much as the translation programs are useful today, and they do very good translations, it doesn't replace language learning, because when you're learning a language, you are actually learning a set of customs and rituals, and that's what you're getting out of it, in the sense that the reason you learn a language is to actually interact with people that speak that language. And a lot of that is understanding the kinds of rituals that structure human relationships in that culture. And obviously, you get an AI translation, you're not going to learn any of that, right? And so walking around, so like if you imagine kind of walking around in a foreign country and using your AI to communicate with people, right? Having that, it's going to you're not going to have the type of relationship with those people that you want, because you want to interact with them in a way that's appropriate to that culture and their habits and rituals and customs and beliefs, right? And I think that part of, I think what's essential about what we do in the humanities is precisely the kind of acculturation into a tradition that allows us to then be, competent adults interacting in that tradition. And that's why, I insist on this idea of Western culture, not because it's Western, but it's because it's our tradition, and it forms basically the kind of language within which we can interact with other people in our country. that language of thought, really, and that tradition of text, that's the currency with which we can interact with people, because that's what's been handed down to us, and that's what people are used to, and that's what people are. And if you lose that, then you lose that basic set of habits and customs and rituals that, like in a language, are what are the substance of human relationship, right? And so, I mean, I think there's a fundamental level in which that education in the humanities is really that education into being, what I guess what Iris said in the beginning, being a human being, but being a human being in a specific time and place, right? And then aside from that, I'm very impressed with what you're doing at Hildegard College, and one of the reasons that it resonates with me is because that activity of thinking and writing, right? I've found, so for those of you know, I've been sort of pursuing this avocation of a political activity recently, kind of a political activist, call it, right? And what that involves is, what I've discovered is that I like it because, one of the reasons I really like it is because the kind of activity you do in kind of thinking and writing is, it involves creativity, it involves a lot of frustration, but it involves a kind of an intellectual journey where you don't know where the end is, right? You don't know where you're going, right? And you end up figuring it out as you go along, right? And you get these discoveries. And, I think in the world of business, but also in the world of politics, you get that same experience, actually, but it's not in the world of ideas, it's in the world of human relationships. And that kind of feeling your way around the world through developing personal relationships with people and kind of seeing and navigating that in order to kind of both achieve your goals, but also kind of adjust your goals, right? That seems to be the kind of bridge, I think, that you have between the humanities and something like business, where there's that same kind of necessity of creativity, but it's in a different plane of. But it's clear that you can't do the business without also having that same kind of creativity in reading and writing, because obviously you're dealing with new things and concepts and ways of changing the world. So so there's an aspect of that aspect is precisely what AI can't do, right? Is that kind of creation for and tailored to the specific context in which there's just lots of moving parts and a kind of merging of kind of an empirical reality with a certain set of goals and values that you hold. That just doesn't happen with AI.
We have another question from Pramod, but I just want to take a minute also on this question because it's a really interesting one. It's really at the heart of, I think, this session. I just heard from one of our professors of teaching in computer science a presentation about kind of his use of AI in the classroom, but also educational research he was doing on basically the kind of prompting structure. And he had a sort of fast, medium, and slow prompting structure. And basically, the outcome of this was that the slow was the best for longer term learning. And I think that's really significant because our underlying assumption and what we're sold really is if you can do it faster, it's better. And the technology has that kind of drive, and the interest behind that technology have that drive. And we've managed to accept the idea of slow cooking as perhaps higher quality cooking. I think slow learning is also something that we should really embrace. And David used the term of adult, and I think, maturation takes time. Connected enlightenment with the notion of maturation, that takes time. And getting to maturation, believe me, as someone who's now over 60, getting to maturation sooner is not necessarily better. So anyway, I think this question of time in experience and learning is really something that the humanities have the ability to expose and illuminate in ways that I think really stand, in some ways, in a critical contrast with this drive towards acceleration at all cost. Please, Pramod.
Thank you very much for this really enlightening session. I've learned a lot through the discussion. We in the university are organized around disciplines, so philosophy, language, and what have you, and engineering. But the real world is not organized like that. The real world is what it is. And so the question that I want to pose to you is, how does the humanistic education or humanities education allow us to integrate knowledge across fields so that it's relevant to the real world? I mean, are we doing a good job of this? Can we do a better job of this? So I'm looking at sort of I come at it from an engineering and technology perspective, and I see a world that's increasingly driven by technology. And I'm afraid that without having this kind of integration of insights and knowledge from different fields, we are not going to be in a good position to shape this world for a better future. So, kind of an open-ended question to all of you.
I think that's a great concluding question, and maybe I'll ask each of our panelists to take that.
That's a really good question. I'll be a little bit vulnerable here and go back 8 years. And I remember sitting in office hours with undergraduate students at a university, and these were undeclared majors. And so these were students asking me, hey, make me excited about becoming an English major. And I realized I couldn't tell them to. And I couldn't tell them to because what I found valuable, what I had come to found valuable about the study of English and all of what that means was not primarily the things that let me do, but the things that let me possess. So all the things that AI, and I'm very worried about what AI is going to do to education, but all the things that AI can replace for us are things that the humanities teach us to do. And they will replace those things in some ways, but it can't replace the things that we possess. And yet, I found that the things that we possess are not things that a student is really getting through the study of literature, which is what I taught, only. And historically, you see them possess those intellectual virtues, those kinds of intelligences, those fluencies and ideas through study across the disciplines, interdisciplinary study as we call it. And so I stopped encouraging students to major in English because I couldn't make a liberal arts argument for the study of English. If it was the study of English and economics and philosophy and history and politics, I could. And I'm aware that I'm in a room with a lot of people that teach in traditionally structured departments, but I'll just say what I think, which is that in my experience, the best way to make the humanistic study transferable to a world in which you're not in a discipline is to make undergraduate education, especially, completely cross-disciplinary.
So yeah, I agree with that, and I guess the way I really see humanities education is really not so much, in humanities majors, so much as a general education that's oriented around humanities. And I think that's the key, that everybody should be learning about the humanities. And this idea of a kind of tradition that I'm talking about is really interdisciplinary. I mean, I think that kind of a curriculum that Matthew was talking about, I think is really valuable. It's interdisciplinary, it does philosophy, it does history, it does literature, it does art, but ultimately humanities is always going to be about human meaning. And that's, human meaning is going to have to integrate everything, right? Because what does life mean for us? Well, it's not going to be just technology. It's not just going to be just economics or politics. It'll depend on your situation and your whatever, your status in life, I suppose. But that question of human meaning, that's the big question, right? And humanities is always going to be addressing that. And to that extent, I agree with Tyrus about the slow learning. And I think, I think there was, I don't know, maybe I'm idealizing, but I have this vision, and I guess I participated to a certain extent as an undergraduate of going to college and just wandering around the university intellectually trying to figure yourself out and figuring out what's meaningful to you and spending 4 years doing it, right? That's the slow learning approach that I think has value precisely because you don't know where it's going to end up. And because you don't know where it's end up, you're kind of constantly kind of trying to figure things out. And that's where you end up with something new. That's where you end up with something where you couldn't predict from the beginning. And I think that's ultimately what we can get that'll set us apart from an AI.
Yeah, just, I mean, nothing about philosophy narrows you to the specific way any questions have been framed in the past, philosophical questions. So there's always room to connect with other people doing other enterprises, technology, other fields, and that often are operating with implicit philosophical assumptions, views, pictures. There's room for engagement. AI is a good example of this. It emerges not from national research labs, unlike some other technologies, but for interaction between these firms and universities, including philosophers like Hubert Dreyfus, big Heideggerian, Heideggerian Merleau-Ponty, applying it to robotics, engaging Rodney Brooks, and then there's others like Hinton who are operating with implicitly representational theory of mind. There are different strands, in early AI that they're trying to develop, but they're, in the first place, they're just philosophical pictures that are very much what gets debated among philosophers of mind. And then, if the philosophers of mind are lazy, they'll just sort of abstract away, as we'll say, from factual questions, right? And then we'll find something to debate, right? And get promoted and we'll get too professionalized in the bad way, right? As opposed to like, no, okay, forget that. Let's do the hard stuff. Let's do the thing that makes philosophy awesome and relevant, the thing that's always been great about, and then engage that. And that's how it's how we got the incredible technological breakthroughs, which now to some extent they can grow beyond the philosophical underpinnings of them, because it's just once something works, people are like, well, who cares what it means or whether it amounts to a similar outcome of the mind or intelligence. It just does lots of things. Let's see what else it can do. But that philosophy is always sort of ready and waiting to do that too. I'm trying to do the same thing in political philosophy with money and banking and break down ways that those two things have been too separate. But I won't bore you with that. I'll stick with the sexy AI.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists, our audience, and I'm aware since this is the end of a rich day of presentations, also Duncan and all the people involved in the organization of this whole event, including this panel. So give it up for everybody.